Well, listener. Look who it is. Me, Taplines host Dave Infante, returning as promised to bring you part 2 of our 2-part episode with Philip Van Munching, author of Beer Blast, inside the story of the brewing industry's bizarre battles for your money. If you listen to part 1, which should be directly prior to this one in your podcast feed, you'd already know that Philip shares his name with Van Munching and Company, the importing firm his grandfather founded in the United States post-Prohibition after convincing a Dutch brewery called Heineken that he could sell their beer to American drinkers. Spoiler alert, he absolutely could. Until Corona came along and finally toppled the green bottled juggernaut in the 90s, Heineken reigned, basically peerless, as the top-selling imported beer in the country. If you didn't tune into part 1, you may want to go back and listen to it before this episode. Again, it's right behind this one in your podcast feed. Or maybe you don't. I don't know what you're into. It's up to you. Anyway, we wrapped up part 1 in discussion about a particular thorn in Heineken's side in the 80s, Boston Beer Company's Jim Koch, who cleverly clawed his way into mainstream press conversations in part by taking some whacks at the Dutch brand that it fell to Philip to parry. We pick up the tale to learn about the birth of brown-bottled Amstel Light, the corporate folly of Heineken Light, and the fate of the flagship brand, Van Munching and Company, and Philip himself, after the Europeans finally took back the family's long-held import franchise to run American operations themselves. It's Philip Van Munching, it's Heineken, it's the corporate handoff of American drinkers' one-time favorite import, and it's all right here, right now, on Vine Pair's Taplines.
What was the line? I sell in a year what they brew in 3 hours.
Yeah.
Like, well, first of all, now you're trying to pretend like it takes us 3 hours to brew beer. Second of all, you're full of shit. But
that's right.
Not
he lumped
to put too
you
fine
in.
A point on it.
Yeah, he didn't
lump us in. He took us on specifically. And I was in the position where I had to be the one answering it all the time.
Yeah,
and the fact that it was brewed in Pittsburgh is what finally got him to shut up. Because I had so many micros calling me in my office to say, let's band together and get this guy.
Yeah.
Because they hated him because they all spent the money to build breweries.
Sure.
Which is huge overhead. And then he'd go to the Great American Beer Festival and wipe the floor with them because he'd spend all of his money giving tickets away. And saying, boy, I sure hope you'll vote for my brand. It was not illegal. It was maybe ethically interesting. All of this is in the book, so no lawyers need to call me. But he was the world's greatest salesman. And the great irony is he reminded me so much of my grandfather.
Really?
He was a terrific storyteller, funny guy. And the one thing I will always say is he made a great product. I had so many friends who were like, you know what? Good beer.
Yeah.
And he did specialties that were really interesting, and he was very good at this. But he made his name on us. And after all these folks called me, I finally started saying to any reporter who called me, they say, Sam Adams Boston Lager. I said, what? No. Sam Adams Pittsburgh Lager. I said, what do you mean? I'd say, look at the label, on the upper label, brewed by contract at the Merrimack whatever.
Sure.
And PGH period, comma, PA.
Yeah. As small as
let
it
me
could
explain
be,
that.
by the way.
That's Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where it's actually brewed in any volume. And we did this so much that he kind of stopped picking on us.
Yeah, he got the message. You have to, I suppose. Jim Koch, I feel like, was also maybe not a yuppie himself, but was also representative of a new type of, for lack of a better term, brewer, although he was not the one mashing in or anything. But, he was a former management consultant. He's undeniably charismatic, and he's a good guy. I've interviewed him many times, and he, like you said, he's an incredible salesperson, tells an unbelievable story. Even today, there are many, in 2023, there are many high-profile brewers that do a lot of volume, at least at the craft level, that don't really appreciate that style of salesmanship, that style of brand building, that style of storytelling. They don't want to do as much of that. It's not where their comfort zone is. He brought a new version or a new aspect to the business that maybe wasn't the big, powerful Augie Bush III or like the Philip Morris guys, running game at the Miller Brewing Company, or the Coors family doing what God knows what they were doing out in Golden, Colorado, and funding the Heritage Foundation in the meantime. But this was the kind of a new flavor. So there was, and now again, like this is now much more familiar because the beer business has gone in a million different directions since. But that was a new tone at the time, I imagine.
Yeah. No, he's been much imitated.
Yeah,
but he's never been equal.
No, yeah, agreed. Well, hopefully, if Jim Cook, if you're listening, we'll have you on the show. We'd love to talk about it. But we're here to talk more about Heineken, Philip, and you're not off the hook just yet. So we talked about sort of the brands that would show up in the brand set. Give me the broader. You mentioned Lacoste, you mentioned Puma, like you mentioned Porsche. Like, what was the constellation of like non-beer brands that Heineken was sort of affiliated with? I mean, it was the Good Life. This was, people who were making money and showing it around. What were they buying besides Heineken?
Häagen-Dazs.
Häagen-Dazs, that's right.
Evian.
Right.
And I'm not really being funny. This is the stuff that you buy or use every day, but suddenly you're paying more for it than you need to.
Yeah, and Häagen-Dazs famously made a huge splash, right, when it hit the market. Yeah,
tremendous.
Yeah.
So again, it's very lovely to think that we were the Ferrari of beers or whatever. We were the Häagen-Dazs because everybody could afford us, but everybody felt rich when they bought us. I love to tell the story. My brother-in-law was coming out of a bodega on 98th Street in Manhattan, and this guy saw that he had a six-pack of Heineken. The guy goes, "You got the Heineken money. You got the Heineken money."
Yeah.
And I thought, that's exactly what my father spent all of his life building up.
Wow.
The idea, and we sold Heineken all over New York City. It had nothing to do with the wealth in any particular borough or any part of town. It was the affordable luxury.
Yep. And because that's really the core of it, right? People can't go out and buy a Porsche. People get a little bit extra money. They can buy a six-pack of Heineken instead of a six-pack of Bud Light or whatever. And this is, I think, we talk about on this podcast, of course, we talk about the beer industry all the time. Craft beer, I think, made it less clear to people in ways that, to some extent, were positive, right? They premiumized beer, as they say in the business and whatever. But beer, to this point, was the affordable luxury working man's drink, in this country, certainly. And to be able to just be like one notch above that, it's like, well, the working man can still scare up another, 95 cents per can or whatever it's going to be, whatever the premium is going to be. So it's still within reach, even though it's, man, the Heineken money, you probably wanted to put that in an ad. What an incredible line. You got that Heineken money.
We couldn't find him to get the rights to that, so we let it go. But, and the thing that the craft beer industry, it's not that they didn't get it. It's that this is what held them back. Most American beer drinkers don't want heavier craft beers.
Right.
And the craft beers that were lighter did great. And I would say that Jim Cook was sort of, Boston Lager was at the outer edge of the American taste bud, as Heineken was.
But you wrote about it in Beer Blast, which, by the way, listener, phenomenal book. If you can't tell, I'm a big fan. I highly recommend you go pick it up at the store or at the local library and give it a read. Philip Van Munching is the author, of course, and he's talking to us right now. You told a story in the book, a little anecdote about the Boston Beer Company's foray, Sam Adams' foray into a darker beer, because it sort of, if I'm not mistaken, right? What was it called? Like Torok or something?
No. This was not Sam Adams. This was us. Heineken Tarobok. Tarwebok.
Okay.
So we've skipped ahead to when Heineken Heineken, which became Heineken USA, has taken over Van Munching and Company. Quick version of that.
Hang on. I want to do. Sure. Let's pause on the Tarobok. I'm sorry, okay. I missed that. Let's talk about the Van Munching and Company transition into when Heineken takes over, because as you mentioned, or you gestured to earlier in the conversation, this is not forever. Van Munching and Company is no longer importing Heineken. Now Heineken is running the brand. When does that happen, Philip?
So the background is that my grandfather signed this stunning deal with Heineken in 1960 that gave Van Munching and Company the rights to all Heineken brands through my father's lifetime. Okay? Mm-hmm. So my father at that point was not that old.
Yeah. Companies don't write contracts like that anymore.
No, they don't. But again, they did it when the volume was so low.
Sure.
And he kept doing multi-year contracts, and finally he got them to sign this thing. And then from the late 70s on, every year they were coming to my father, what's it going to take? We want to buy this back. What's it going to take? And my grandfather passed away, and my father basically had two choices. When you inherit a company, you either sell it and give Uncle Sam his cut of your inheritance tax, or you wait for Uncle Sam to come in, look through your books, say what he thinks it's worth, and demand half. And while my father could have paid that, he was 65 years old when this happened, 1990. And he just said, look, they've been after me forever. He was very friendly with Freddie Heineken until Freddie's passing. He was dealing with what he thought were a bunch of gentlemen, and he signed a nice deal with them, which is why I can afford all the books you see behind me. And says, I will stay on for 3 or 4 years to run it for you. So this happens right as my first child is conceived. I go into my father's office and tell him, because I'm superstitious, I'm telling nobody. And I finally tell him, and he says, well, you've told me your news, I'll tell you mine. I sold the company. And when they picked me off the floor with a spatula, and I said, should I clean out my desk today? Or he said, no. You're in the contract. You have every opportunity for advancement, as does your brother. My brother Chris was with us in the sales department. And he soldiered on for 3 years, and I had a front row seat for what happens to family-run companies when a larger entity comes in and decides how things should be run. And my father made it 3 or 4 full years before he retired. And I lasted 9 months with the new guys after.
Wow.
And I've lost track of your question. God forgive me.
Well,
I'm sorry.
that's basically the question: is what happens? What's the transition? Why does it happen? Which you covered. This lifetime contract that your grandfather finagled with Heineken, which at the time, to your point, didn't worry about the American market because they're not doing real, serious volume there. Who cares? Whatever. Right. Give this Van Munching guy, his blood contract here.
Right.
But so eventually that comes up enough times with your father. He decides to sell at a sounds like a precarious moment in your life. You just found out that your wife is pregnant. Yeah. You're like, oh man, this is a lot of change coming at you very quickly, Philip.
Thanks, Dad. I think McDonald's might be hiring near me. I'm going to go check that now.
So Heineken comes, they take over. This is, did you say 1990?
Yeah, it was about, I believe it was 1990.
Thereabouts.
It switches over. It stays as Van Munching and Company until a year or two after he leaves.
Okay.
So it's still Van Munching and Company. He is still in charge. He's still calling all the shots. But what's happening is they're starting to send people over.
Sure.
They send a guy in the sales department who might be litigious, so I won't mention his name, who immediately goes out and talks to our distributors about all the things he's going to do when it's his company to run. And all of this gets back to my father.
Sure.
From all over the country.
Worked with these distributors for decades. Yeah, of course they're going to tell them.
Right. And, we're going to do Heineken Light, which there was no way in hell we were ever going to do.
Right.
We should talk about that.
Yes.
And we're going to have 7-ounce packaging. We're going to do this and we're going to do that. And he's supposed to be out on a learning the business trip, and he's talking about his days as president to come. And my father calls him into his office and says, what's with this? Oh, I didn't say any of that. Just denies everything. My father throws him out. And the guy that's running Heineken at the time, Carl Verstein, says to my father, tough luck, he's staying. And my father says, then I'm going. And This set the pattern, and Freddie Heineken was still alive, and Carl didn't want to have to explain to Freddie Heineken why his lifelong friend left in a huff.
Right.
So he said, okay, he's gone, and he just parked him somewhere and eventually put him back in. But we started to see people telling us how we should do things, and I tell the story in the book. Heineken comes to us, we're going to do the Whitbread Around the World race. We said, that's great. What is it? It's a yacht race.
That's right. I forgot
that's
about
really
this.
That's really big in America. We're going to do really well with this. Like, no, we're not. We're not going to do this. Come on.
Yeah,
They want us to spend millions of dollars in a couple of markets where this race stops. My father is puckish enough to point out to them that Whitbread is a brewery. So the Whitbread Around the World race for the Heineken Cup is like saying the Budweiser Around the World race for the Miller Cup. It's just stupid.
Yeah.
But they're so full of themselves, and they do all their presentation. My father says no. And one of the guys walks out and says to somebody he doesn't realize is good friends with my father, Jesus Christ, I thought they bought the company. And this was the level of tension that was building as my father's days were ending at the company. And when he left, they brought a guy that had run the Murphy Irish Stout operation in Ireland to run the company. He didn't spend a day in the U.S. beer market. They brought a Dutchman in to be the marketing director, who was my boss. He immediately hired brand managers for Heineken and Amstel Light, who were younger than I was, and I was a punk. Who had never spent a day in the beer business, and within 2 days were telling me what we had been doing wrong for years.
And these were, we mentioned this earlier in the conversation, Philip, that this is where, if my memory is right from the book, this is where sort of the homogenizing influence of of consumer packaged goods, CPG, as a category starts to sort of work its way into this formerly family business. It's very like oriented around beer specifically, not around, we do some beer, we do some soda, we bottle, whatever. Like,
right.
That's you started. I forget. One of them was maybe from like Schick or something. But like, the brand is not important. The fact of the matter was, if I'm not mistaken, that this is where you start to see those sort of commodity influences creeping into the business, right?
Well, and a level of sophistication that I'm fine with, but was kind of funny. And I'll give you an example. I take these two out for lunch when they're hired, and we're sitting at, I believe, Benihana, and they're bitching about the fact that they don't have P&L responsibility. And I look at them and say, what's that? Because I honestly don't know.
Yeah.
Because we don't do marketing speak.
Sure.
At VM & Co. And they look at me like I have 3 fingers shoved up my nose. It's profit and loss. We don't have profit and loss responsibility. And I said, wait, I think I'm getting this now. You're saying you should set the budgets for both brands. Yeah, that's the job. Well, it's the job if you've been in the job, but you just got here yesterday. You have no idea how the imported beer market works.
Sure.
You've worked, one was Procter & Gamble. One was a Proctoid, right?
Yeah.
And the other, I think, was Schick. And, ladies' razors, fantastic, but it's not the same as alcoholic beverage.
And then you get yourself into a lot of trouble trying to treat it that way. I mean, it's just not, it's a regulated product. The relationships are totally different. Distributors are notoriously averse to change generally. You can't just roll in on them and tell them you're going to do something different. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And I got a very nice note from a woman whose family owned, I want to say Johnson's Oil Soap. One of these.
Okay, yeah.
Is that right? Johnson's Oil Soap?
Yeah.
Murphy's Oil
I was
Soap.
going to say,
like
I think Murphy's is soap, yeah.
Who said, Philip, I read your book and I'm having, oh God, what's the word for it?
PTSD.
She said, I'm having minor, but yes, that's exactly right. She said, I'm having little panic attacks because this is exactly what happened when a very large company bought us out. And I knew my days were numbered by my own hand very quickly because I'm sitting in meetings with people who don't understand anything about it. And I'm not telling them how things should be. I'm just telling them to listen to what others are saying. And it was pretty brutal.
But here maybe is a good place to pick up the thread that I prematurely introduced to the conversation about some of the innovations that start getting handed down, right? Top down. And just as a quick aside, listener, to sort of frame up the bit of the conversation that we just had, because I really think this is an important piece of the puzzle. As much as Heineken signified sort of aspirational yuppiedom to a lot of people, it was not exempt from the broader market forces that were producing those sort of like cultural manifestations of yuppies, right? You have globalization going on. You have increasing corporatization going on, where I mentioned specifically the idea of CPG as like this category that salespeople theoretically or marketing people theoretically can move across, right? Like that is a new idea, and it's the widgetization of beer. I think that Heineken was, at least, in Philip, in your experience that you set down in the book, Heineken was, victim might be too strong a word, but it was certainly acted upon by those forces.
No question.
Yeah.
No, and you also had a very large corporation headquartered in Europe who loved the idea of synergies among countries.
Sure.
One of the things that happened while my father was still there was they were running all of this market research. And eventually, and I think he had just left when they hit us with this report, they were trying to come up with a global positioning for Heineken beer. And what was really funny about that was in some markets, Heineken is Budweiser. It's made locally, it's cheap, it's whatever. In some markets, it's super premium.
Yeah.
In some markets, it's the good time beer. And my brother Chris looked at all of this stuff and he said, I could have saved them a lot of money. I've got a great tagline. Heineken goes great with cheese. So that was about where they were headed with all the nonsense. Yeah. And they eventually dropped the globalization thing because they realized it just cost them a lot of money to do that.
Sure.
And I kind of want to back up too and say that we were certainly not averse to extending the portfolio. And my father wanted to do so and did so. My grandfather would never go beyond Heineken.
Right.
We did Heineken Special Dark, very small volume, but we did it. But my father actually invented Amstel Light from this standpoint. Late 70s, he wants to do a light beer. He says, no way in hell am I doing Heineken Light.
Not going to put that under the flagship.
And those of us old enough to have lived through the beginning of the light beer market, there was a great commercial, and I'll be damned if I can remember what the brand was anymore, but it was this old timer, and he's got a pitcher of beer and a pitcher of water.
Ortlieb, Joe Ortlieb.
Joe Ortlieb.
In Philly.
Thank you.
Yeah, we spoke about, listener, go back and listen to our episodes with Maureen Ogle where we talk about the light beer wars. She specifically brings this up. Sorry, Philip, I didn't mean to interrupt. Tell us about the commercial. Quite all right.
Yeah. Maureen is a much better guest than I am.
No,
Maureen's awesome.
I disagree. We're having a ripping time.
I know she wrote about this too. And he basically pours a pitcher of beer into a glass. He said, he pours beer into a pitcher. This is how we make beer. This is how we would make light beer. And he pours water into it.
Right.
And then he lifts it up and he says, this is why we don't make light beer.
Right.
And it was brilliant because that's not how light beer is made. And he wasn't saying it.
Right.
But he sure was intimating all that stuff that you were seeing on the market was nonsense. And my father took the point and said, we're not going to give the brand the image that we could do a light version of it or a cheap version of it, whatever. And he said, would you take your Amstel brand, which we don't import, and make a light version, and then we will have a light beer to offer.
Because at this time, to make sure listeners understand, at this time, it becomes clear that Heineken needs some answer for the light beer from Miller, which is, what it first started out as. You're not competing directly with them, but there's so much, and then Budweiser Light gets introduced in 1982 and then becomes Bud Light in 1984, Coors Light 1978. There's just an enormous amount of momentum around light beer, and your father recognizes, probably correctly, that
it was an opportunity.
Yeah,
for
you're going to get, and you might get left behind if you don't. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, volume-wise, we were so small comparatively.
Yeah.
It wasn't even really being left behind. It was just this was an opportunity to do something new, and to give our salesmen and our distributors something else to push that wasn't directly competitive. That's a huge phrase, and everything I'm about to say wasn't directly competitive. We didn't come up with we didn't say, let's bring Amstel beer in, because what would Amstel's competition be? Heineken. What is the point of that? And again, I'm foreshadowing here, Dave.
Yep.
But he comes up with Amstel Light. It does extremely small but really well growing volume. It cracks the top 10 in just a couple of years. He really builds it. He was so proud of it. I was so proud of it because he had come up with this whole thing. We did a Canadian import called Grizzly for a bit. We eventually did a non-alcoholic Buckler. He had no problem growing our portfolio. We did Murphy's Irish Stout. We brought that in. And we were doing these things. The new guys come in and they go, well, we need to do Heineken Light. Why would you do that? Who are your two competitive sets there? Heineken and Amstel Light. What is the genius? Well, I wrote about this in the book, and
I remember. Yeah.
I said what a stupid idea, and then the book comes out, and then a few years later they bring in Heineken Light.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
and it does. And I am no genius. Ask my wife. Ask my daughters. There is no chance I'm going to be mistaken for Einstein. But I had said, you bring that in. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to sell gangbusters for a year while everybody tries it. It's going to kill Amstel Light, and Heineken's going to go down a bit, and then it's going to go way down. And that's exactly what happened. At one point, Heineken Light was the fastest dropping beer in the beer category, period.
Man, that is not a category you want to lead right there.
Hey, we're number one at dropping.
Don't read the fine print on what we're number one in. Just,
and you had raised it before, Heineken Taro Bock.
Yes.
And I mispronounce it to be funny, and because I'm still not really sure that Dutch pronunciation is something the American mouth is ever going to get around. It's spelled Tarwebok, and it's pronounced Heineken Tarobak. And I sat in on research that they did. And, if you ever get a chance to sit in on qualitative research versus quantitative is just we're pulling numbers in.
Sure.
Qualitative is we're going to sit in the room with you and we're going to say, if this beer was an animal, what animal would it be? But
the good shit.
They have the moderator.
That's the good shit right there.
They have the moderator. My pen is a wand, and if you had this wand and you could change one thing, what would you? You're basically asking people to come up with something that sucks.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in the case of Heineken Taro Bock, the first thing is, what do you think of this? And we're like, we don't like the name. Why? Because we can't say it. Well, what if I told you it was a word that meant red tower, and it was, and they eventually talked these people into saying, "Oh, this is great. I love this name." Well, that's not what happens at home.
Or in the supermarket.
I don't like that name. That's stupid. They don't have a guy standing there with his pen wand telling them, "Oh, no, really, it's a great name, and we can report to the people paying our salary what a great name it is if only we talk to you for 20 minutes about it first." So they introduce Heineken Taro Bock and something called Amstel 1870. And I think 1870 was the total volume that they sold of it over a few years. I think 1870 bottles.
Now, was that bottles, kegs, or barrels there? Yeah.
So they basically spent more money destroying unsold beer for these things that they would bring in with no forethought than they did make off them. And the analogy for me as I was writing the book, that was when Miller Brewing decided that they needed to bring out Miller beer because there was no such thing. Mm-hmm. There was Miller High Life, Miller Genuine Draft, and light beer from Miller.
Yep.
And I sat in a room in Milwaukee with very nice people who were talking to me for the book, and they were very excited, and they drew this on a wall for me, and it was the three brands in a horizontal row. And they said, Budweiser does so well because it's got a vertical brand structure. I said, explain that to me. Well, it's Bud, and then it's Bud Light and Bud Dry and Bud Ice. And we have a horizontal brand structure. We have Miller Genuine Draft, light beer from Miller. I said, okay, I get that. So we need something above all of them. So we're bringing out Miller beer. And I said, exactly how many consumers are sitting in a bar going, if they had a goddamn vertical brand structure, I would buy their beer, but I'm not going to now. And nobody could answer that question. I wasn't that unkind, but I was somewhat unkind and said, what do you think the call for this is? And it was a huge money-wasting flop for Miller because it was a beer that was born not out of any market asking for it, but a bunch of marketers sitting around a table going, hey, our brand structure needs tweaking.
Right.
It's insanity.
The neologism that I've heard for that type of problem or solution in terms of a problem is solutioneering, right? Like, well, we got to show that we've done something, so let's figure out the solution to a problem that maybe isn't there.
and that's something that the book touches on a lot.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
There, when Miller came into the picture and light beer did very well, all of a sudden the only way to really grow was to come up with a new category and own it.
Yeah,
and so you ended up with dry beer and ice beer and, all these things
Extra,
that made absolutely no sense and had to be explained and often weren't even real. Like my favorite was ice beer. You bring down the temperature enough that water freezes at the top.
Yep.
If you skim that ice off, it's more concentrated, more alcoholic. Well, you couldn't do that for legal reasons, so then you let it melt and you call it ice beer. We got it really cold for a minute there. It's like, hell, guys, I can do that in my fridge or my freezer.
Yeah, freezer.
Just put it in for 30 minutes and remember before the bottle breaks to take it out, and I've got ice beer. And, But this is what was happening. It was no longer people saying, there's this need for a beer that has fewer calories. There's a need for a beer that's lighter in taste, so you can have a few more, lighter in alcohol content, that you can have a few more. There's a need for non-alcoholic. But no, we're making up things now just so we can say we own this space in the market.
Philip, we've gone, the distance and more here in this conversation. We started back in 1933. We spent a lot of time in the 80s and the early 90s, and of course in 1994 you would leave. What was that? Was it still called Van Munching and Company when you left, or no?
Until just after I left,
Okay.
It became. And this also, and I'll make it brief because at this point you're so sick of talking to me, and I bless you for doing it while I'm sick. They came to me and said, we're going to change the company name, and I was like, I totally get it. There's no Van Munching at the head of Van Munching and Company anymore. Here are my recommendations. And I couldn't honestly tell you what they were, but they were like Amsterdam importing, something like that. I said, here's what you really need not to do. Don't put Heineken in the name, because the way people have known my name, as we talked about at the beginning, you had to by law on radio ads. And back then radio ads everybody heard them all the time.
Sure.
You have to, it's the mandatory, imported by X, imported by Amsterdam importing New York, New York. Mm-hmm. If you say Amstel Light imported by Heineken USA, somebody's sitting at home going, wait, they don't make Heineken in Holland anymore? Why am I paying more for this?
Yep.
What, Heineken imported by Heineken USA. Why is Heineken USA? What is that? And of course, it's exactly what they did. And it was just so dumb.
Scroll the time machine forward now a little bit further here. We'll wrap up.
Let the bitterness fade away.
So this is kind of what I wanted to ask you. I mean, you've moved on with your life. You've written 4 books. You're an author more than you're a beer man many times over at this point. But you obviously still have familial connection with parts of the Heineken brand, though of course not in its current, contemporary form. When you look at what Heineken is doing today, like what's your, I'm not asking you to analyze their business or their branding or anything, more about like, what emotional space does that take up in your life? Like, what's the legacy there for you?
It was somewhat bitter for a while my father was still alive. My dad passed some years back. But while he was alive, it didn't just feel, they were very dismissive of his efforts as a company.
That's hard.
Every once in a while, we'd get some missive from Freddie's daughter or whatever, pretending that they had any respect. But the new folks basically came in and said these people had no idea what they were doing. And we kept Heineken number 1 for 60 years.
Yeah.
Kind of had some idea of what we were doing.
Yeah.
And the new guys lost that within 2. Corona's been number 1 ever since. Wow. And that just chafes me beyond words.
Yeah.
But, I've looked at the advertising over the years, and some of it's been okay. And a lot of it's been incredibly silly when you consider it's advertising for something that costs more than its competition. I just saw a Heineken Silver ad. I believe Heineken Silver is a reduced calorie version of Heineken. I have no idea. I couldn't care less.
I think it's actually,
but it is a brand.
It's a brand. I believe it's higher ABV. Is okay. What I believe Silver is. Could be wrong, but Probably not great.
No, you're
probably not great that neither of us knows for sure.
That's exactly right. And there's nothing in the title. Is it made from silver? Can I, coat the car with it?
Metal poisoning with it? Yeah.
But it's an ad, and this is my beef with most advertising. Let's get outside of even the beer business, but it's somewhat entertaining. It's set in the Viking era, and there's something about you've just killed this Viking's pet and something, but I guess if you offer him a Heineken Silver, he will let you marry his daughter. I don't know. But it says nothing about why you should pay more for this beer.
Yeah.
And we don't have to sit here and just say, Heineken tastes tremendous. No wonder it's number one. But if you walk away from the positioning as it's the number one imported beer, you got to ask yourself why you're doing that. And if you're doing
and what
ads,
else you have to offer. Yeah.
And if you're doing ads that could be slotted in as Budweiser ads and your Heineken, you got to ask yourself what you're doing.
Sure. Those two things in your era and certainly in your father's era, there was plenty of daylight between those two brands, and those two things should never be interchangeable if those, if the brand's position is defended as it ought to be. Yeah.
When my dad's replacement came in, he and I got along great at first, and he pulled me into his office one day, big Irishman, and he says, "Philip, I got this tape. You got to see this tape." And he puts this tape in, and it's like it would be really good Budweiser advertising. It's very infectious, party going on, whatever. That's what we should be doing. That's what we should be doing. And I just went, "Oh man, we are so screwed."
But you had, but you had a foot out the door, or you would soon, and you're onward and upward ever since.
Exactly right.
Philip, thank you so much for joining us on Taplines.
Dave, it's been a blast.
A beer blast, of course. Go check out the book, listeners. Philip, again, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for going back down memory lane, and hopefully this explains to people a little bit more about why Heineken has such an indelible place in the culture. A lot of it had to do with Van Munching and Company and your father's work and your work building the brand here in the United States.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate it.
Have a good one. Don't forget, listener, this was part 2 of our 2-part episode with Philip Van Munching about Heineken. If you somehow missed part 1, never fear. You should be able to find it directly prior to this one in your podcast feed. Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.